It is my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Sarah Hoff, who earned her PhD in psychology and now works as a deputy warden. And her talk is entitled, Just Vision, Our Attitudes Toward Criminal Offenders.
So there's a running joke my husband has when he meets new people. He tells them that I'm in prison without specifying that I work in prison. And similarly, I have kids at varying ages. They're mostly pretty young, and I know for a fact that one of my sons has told his friends that I'm in jail. So I don't know what the teachers think. And also, just a disclaimer for me, these are my views and opinions. These don't reflect the Department of Corrections. So my talk tonight reflects questions that I've considered over the years that I've worked in the criminal justice field. And when I really began formulating my ideas and reflecting on them, I can tie their origin back to a question that I asked myself many times over my career. So go back in time to fall 2006. I know many of you were tiny, tiny humans at that point. I was a sophomore here at Creighton, and I lived in Kennefic Hall. One afternoon, my older sister unexpectedly showed up at my door, and I received the terrible news that my dad had been diagnosed with cancer. Sadly, he passed away about 7 weeks later at the age of 50. My dad was a great man with many of the qualities we would ascribe to a good person. So jumping ahead in time, as I started to go through my professional training and gain experiences, I worked with many people who would not be considered good people. There were individuals who hurt and abused others, who had psychopathic traits, who lived very unhealthy lifestyles, who were filled with anger and seemed to care for nobody but themselves. Sometimes these individuals were over the age of 50. And so the big question that I continuously found myself asking was why they got to live and my dad had to die. So this question started to prompt other questions when I saw guys come into prison with very long sentences for some offenses and very short sentences for others that I viewed as much more violent or harmful. Some clients I worked with were denied parole even though they'd gone through incredible personal changes, while others I saw were granted parole that I saw as much more likely to reoffend. I thought a lot about what makes somebody a good person and to what extent someone's past actions should impact society's willingness to forgive. So I'm going to start with a few questions for everybody, so just raise your hand. Who here has regularly interacted with people who've committed a felony? It's actually probably more than you think. Right now in Nebraska, we have around 11,000 people on probation, around 900 on parole, and approximately 2,300 individuals are released from prison every year. So more than likely, you've interacted with felons all the time, you just didn't know it. It's a necessity in our society that we do have to pass judgment on others, whether it's to measure their reliability, risk to others, or likelihood to succeed. So with that being said, do you think that people should be judged based more on their actions or based on their overall moral character? So who says actions? People should be based more on their actions. Okay. And then who thinks people should be judged based more on their overall moral character? Okay. So that's actually pretty split. Who feels that felons should be considered for careers and full-time positions that have adequate pay and benefits such as healthcare? Okay. Keep your hand raised if you're supportive of felons driving a semi-truck, working in a warehouse, working in the kitchen of a restaurant, working at the checkout counter of a store, changing the oil of your car, picking up your trash or recycling at your house, delivering a package, replacing your roof, being your Uber driver, installing the dishwasher in your home. Okay. Put your hands down. Thank you. This is not my facility, but just to give a backdrop. I work at a minimum and medium security men's prison with a population of almost 800. We're generally seen as a transitional facility, housing mostly inmates who were within 5 years of parole eligibility or their discharge. So there's an older inmate at my facility who's very quiet. He's a little shy. He's respectful to staff and acts as a mentor to others. He's really quick to volunteer. He spends much more time listening than talking. He helped me as a discussion leader many times for a group I used to lead. He's really well respected by his peers, and he follows institutional rules. He encourages other inmates to utilize available resources, encourages them to lead pro-social lives. If he left prison today, I am confident that he would never break the law again. This man's going to die in prison. He will never get the opportunity to be free, but he still chooses to do the right thing. Does that mean he's a good person? On the other side of things, I observe people all the time in the community who act in ways that are rude, careless, sexist, or profane. I've had some coworkers across my lifetime who I would describe that way. I'm sure some of you have as well, and if you haven't, you probably will. Since most of you, which then leads to the question, when you compare the inmate I described to Chad, the awful coworker, sorry if any of you are named Chad, who would you rather have in your home or your workplace? Who deserves mercy or forgiveness more? So every day, people commit violent crimes. The news often highlights these stories and focuses on the heinousness of the actions and the harm to the victims. So often as the court process and the sentencing progress, society is united in appealing for guilty verdicts and lengthy sentences. Punishment and accountability are paramount concerns for the perpetrator who's cast as the villain. Maximum sentences are celebrated, and the overarching belief is that justice has been achieved. And although the judge considers mitigating evidence in the sentencing phase, society doesn't appear interested in a defendant's identity apart from the crime. They don't care if he was abused as a child, experiences addiction, or is a provider for his children. The narrative about this person is very clear, and things that don't fall in line with that are given no attention. Even the language used in these articles and news stories can be dehumanizing and reduces people to labels. Not surprisingly, this narrowing of focus disproportionately affects minorities and people of color, and the terminology used often leads to unfair stereotypes and biases. There aren't a lot of people proposing mercy for thugs, rapists, murderers, or gangsters. There would likely be a public outcry if leniency is perceived. So sometimes I think about what this sort of treatment would be like for me. So what if I made a terrible mistake one day? Maybe I had too much to drink and I got into an accident that killed the other driver. Or maybe I lost my temper with one of my very strong-willed children and severely injured them. I would be desperate for people to understand that that action does not define me. It is not representative of the choices I have made to that point or the person that I have striven to be. I would want people to believe that despite that mistake, I'm still a good person. But if I'm in the newspaper or on TV for that crime, what do you think online comments about me are going to be? The people across the community who read that story on their phones or on their computers and they don't hesitate to press that add comment button, they don't know anything about me other than that one thing I did. But they don't need any more information than that to decide that I'm a horrible person, I don't deserve to see my family again, I should live the rest of my life behind bars. It's unsettling to think about that. After something terrible happens, our first instinct is to be angry, to blame, and to punish. If someone can do something so horrible, they deserve to be miserable. Forgiveness and positive or mitigating factors are given little attention at this stage. So in my job, I'm on the other end of the judicial fence, the side where people are serving the sentences for the crimes they've committed. I can tell you that from my experience, there is no direct correlation between the crime that somebody's committed and whether or not they're a good or bad person. Most of the time when I interact with our prison population, I don't even know what they're in prison for, meaning I don't know what they did to get there or what they've done in their past. What I may know is how often I hear their names in terms of whether they're getting in trouble, being disrespectful, getting in fights, using substances. But on the other hand, I may know their name because they just completed a group or got a diploma. Maybe they're reconnecting with their children or other family members, working hard in their institutional jobs, communicating with respect. Most of the time, it's not one or the other. People move forward and then make mistakes. I might talk to a guy one day and he's really pissed off about something. He might be arguing, making demands and threats. The next day, I might talk to him again and he's apologetic and recognizes that his behavior is unwarranted. The next day, we might go through it all over again. As I said before, my facility's primary focus is reintegrating people either directly into the community or into a community custody prison. We offer many clinical treatment programs and educational and vocational opportunities. Our reentry and social work staff help people develop release plans that typically include housing, healthcare, and financial or other community resources. Our population blends people with people who come in with very short sentences to others who are coming to us after serving a lot of a very lengthy sentence. Interestingly, the people who most consistently have told me that they don't belong in prison are the ones who are convicted of vehicular manslaughter. So that's essentially a drunk driving accident that killed the other person. Despite the terrible consequences and loss resulting from their actions and choices, they seem to feel different from the other felons, like they're somehow not in the same category. And maybe they don't feel as though they're like the rest of the bad people that they're lumped in with. Prison itself has its own culture, one in which certain offenses are more acceptable than others, and some are considered so disgusting and shameful that those individuals frequently experience harassment, verbal abuse, and isolation. Those serving long sentences can astound us with their positive changes over the years. Some of our inmates had terrible reputations for being dedicated gang members and assaulting staff and others for years, but then seem to reach a point of personal clarity and start moving in a positive and pro-social direction in their actions. You can see their mind frames shift and their whole lives transform. I've seen some of these people become active in their faith, kind in their interactions, and purposeful in their choices. But they're bad people, right? Nothing that they're doing now changes the terrible things that they've done or the harm that they've caused. Well, after time has passed, the emphasis on punishment fades. Society does seem to offer forgiveness and even empathy and support for the same people that it previously denounced. There's a redemption arc that society has embraced if someone achieves monumental change. Will Latif Little is a former gang member and a convicted murderer. He's also given a TED Talk about becoming the best version of yourself. His website identifies him as an expert in emotional intelligence and personal development. You can hire him to do workshops or classes and buy his book. Homeboy Industries is an organization founded by a Jesuit priest, Father Gregory Boyle in Los Angeles. It's the largest gang intervention, rehabilitation, and reentry program in the world. It serves a community of gang members offering treatment, employment, tattoo removal, and other resources and means of support. Father Greg has several books that I highly recommend that share the backgrounds and stories of many of the homies that he's worked with over the years. These stories highlight the humanity and adversity of these same individuals that are also feared and vilified. When we learn a person's story, that person becomes more than a label. They become more than what they did. They may be judged worthy of mercy, support, and even admiration. Even so, are those attitudes deserved? Sometimes I think about these times when society forgives people's past and focuses on the good that they're doing or the changes they've made. What if it wasn't cancer, but one of these reformed individuals that killed my dad? I know I would really struggle with people praising that individual or giving them opportunities not just to return to the community, but to be celebrated and encouraged for their changes. What about what they did? What about the enduring harm I would still feel every day from their actions? Has anyone taken an intro to psychology? Okay, great, a lot of you. Who remembers the fundamental attribution error? Less of you, okay. So that's the tendency for us to over-attribute the mistakes that others make to their personalities or lack of ability, rather than taking into account context or environmental factors. However, when we make mistakes, we don't attribute it to our personal faults, and instead we blame situational factors. So a classic example of this is we might judge a coworker who is late to work as being unreliable or lazy, but if we're late to work, it's because there was bad traffic or a long line at Starbucks. I can fall into this trap a lot too. Over the last several years, there have been many stories of everyday people who do or say something offensive that becomes very public, and they spark outrage. Many of these bad people lose their jobs, lose their friends, receive all kinds of threats, including death threats, by the good people who are judging them. So what better way to shame somebody than to commit a felony yourself of terroristic threats? I bet they get more threats than the people who are arrested for violent crimes. Well, at least when they lose their job, maybe it can go to somebody on parole. Nobody? Are people who do bad things bad people? And can people who do bad things become good people? Can they be forgiven? These are complicated questions that almost always have different answers depending on the circumstances. The less we feel conflicted about this, the more we should worry, because it's not simple. And when we try to make it simple, we rely on shortcuts that too often draw on biases and emotion. If we can't even be consistent in our judgment of why someone's late to work or whether they should lose their job for a tweet they sent out, how can we possibly believe we are judging people fairly or justly when it is something much more important with far greater consequences at stake? So after today, when you hear stories about crimes, felons, inmates, victims, or anything in the criminal justice realm, I challenge you to look more critically about how you decide what people deserve. Have you considered all sides of the issue? Have you put yourself in the shoes of the perpetrator and the victim? Have you considered how you would feel differently if the perpetrator was a close family member or if the victim was? When you hear family or friends use labels or make broad, sweeping judgments about unpopular politicians or public figures, I hope you can be the devil's advocate and offer a richer perspective. Ask those people how much it matters what someone has done versus what kind of a person he or she is. Thank you.